Hello folks, this is my review of the Lightdow 420-800mm f8.3 to f16 lens for DSLR cameras. It's a very inexpensive, long telephoto zoom lens. This review may sound a bit critical, so let me just get something out of the way right now. I think this lens has surprisingly good build and optical quality. It's far from perfect, but for $100, I think it's pretty good. But it's also pretty difficult to get the best possible results from it, and I don't want people to have any misconceptions. So first of all, this is a manual lens. There's no autofocus, no metering or electrical connections or anything like that to the camera at all. Some cameras will offer automatic exposure control in aperture priority mode, but many will have to be in manual mode to work at all. For example, my D7000 here will work in manual mode and in aperture priority mode. My D90 will only work in manual mode. The D90 will not even allow a picture to be taken with this lens in any other mode other than manual. This lens has standard T-ring threads, so it will accept a T-ring for whatever camera you want to use it on. The one I purchased came with a Nikon T-ring. The build quality of the lens is pretty good. It's mostly metal, it has pretty good fit and finish, and overall it feels pretty sturdy. The tripod mount, however, is plastic, and I think that did allow some movement and shake when mounted on a tripod. Also, the lens is fairly light, which is good, but because of that, I wish the tripod mount was further towards the camera. Even at 800mm, it's still camera heavy with it mounted on a tripod, and at 420mm, where it is now, it's just super camera heavy. So, basically when it's mounted on a tripod, the camera's, just kind of constantly pulling back on it. Whereas I think if this was mounted just a little bit further back, it would give it a little bit better balance. On the plus side, there is a metal insert for the threads, so it shouldn't strip out too easily, and it doesn't feel super flimsy. I mean, it doesn't feel like it'll break real easy. I just wish it was a little bit more rigid. I do like that the lens comes with a nice proper lens cap for the front. Works very well. It doesn't come with a proper cap for the back, although it does come with a small push-on cap that just goes onto the T-threads, not actually onto the camera mount. So you would actually have to remove the T-ring every time to use that rear cap. So yeah, that's a bit of a bummer, but not a big deal. Much more importantly, I think it is nice that it comes with this front cap, because when you're out using it, it's just very quick on and off, and it stays on very well. Whereas some of the other inexpensive lenses I've looked at, they have just a really loose-fitting slip-on cap that has a tendency to fall off a lot. It also comes with just kind of a basic vinyl storage pouch that the lens can slip into. The aperture on this lens is not adjustable. The effective aperture changes based on the focal length, but it cannot otherwise be changed. The specs claim an effective aperture of f8.3 at 420mm and f16 at 800mm. So this is a pretty slow lens, especially at the higher telephoto range. You have to unscrew this threaded ring to zoom in or out. Once you unscrew this to unlock it, you can simply push and pull to zoom in and out. All the way out is 800mm, all the way in is 420mm. Once you get it where you want it, you're really going to want to retighten this ring to lock it back in place. If you don't, this is actually the focus ring. And if you don't relock this, when you turn the focus ring, the whole barrel spins and the focus doesn't actually change. So you're going to want to relock this, get it good and tight, and actually see, I still didn't even get it quite tight enough. You want to lock that really tight, and then it will allow you to turn the focus ring without this barrel turning. So overall, the controls aren't too difficult to use, but they are a bit stiff and require some fiddling around, so it's a fairly slow lens to operate. So in my opinion, it wouldn't be very good for a moving subject or really anything that required focal length or focus changes on the fly. It's also very difficult to operate this lens without causing the image to shake around significantly, so I don't really think it would be a very good lens for video. Combine that with no autofocus, stiff controls, limited to no automatic exposure, and personally, I wouldn't use this for video. Because of the aperture and the long focal length, I feel a tripod is essentially a requirement for this lens. In fact, even with a fairly sturdy tripod, camera shake was an issue. Even the shutter actuation itself sometimes imparted a slight but noticeable amount of movement into the image. And for all of my testing, I had it set up on a tripod and I used a remote shutter release most of the time. And even with all that, I still got motion blur in some images. Because of the aperture, this lens also presents a fairly dim image in the viewfinder. High ISO or slow shutter speed can give good exposure levels in the images, but the dim view in the viewfinder can make it difficult to find perfect focus, even in direct sunlight. And also, if your camera has a focus indicator in the viewfinder, on my D90 and also the D7000, there's a little dot that lights up when the subject is in focus. It probably won't be very reliable. On both the D7000 and the D90, the focus indicator was unreliable a lot of the time, and sometimes it didn't work at all. At f8.3, or even worst case scenario, if you are above 420mm with this lens, there just isn't enough light getting to the sensors to give reliable operation all the time. On the positive side, the focus knob is far less sensitive than on the Bauer 500mm lens I reviewed a while back, so it's a bit easier to get in-focus shots than it was with that lens. Even with that, I didn't often get perfect focus on the first attempt. I typically had to tweak it a little bit one way or another to get the focus where I wanted it. But since the focus adjustment is a fairly fine adjustment, it wasn't too bad to just tweak it a little bit, take a couple more shots, and you were pretty likely to get one that was in focus. So it did typically take multiple shots to get a good one, but if I persisted, I think the results were pretty good given the price. So here we can take a look at some examples of the results I was able to get from this lens. Now, full disclosure, I did edit these images in Adobe Lightroom. I usually shoot in RAW format and then import my photos into Lightroom, and from there I tweak them a bit and then export them as JPEG. That's my normal workflow for images, and it is what I did for these. I normally just do minor adjustments to sharpening, contrast, etc., nothing drastic. On these images, I also did just a bit to remove the chromatic aberration and the accompanying purple cast that it gave to some of the images. In fact, here's a crop of an image with no adjustments made, and on the bright feathers of the geese where the sun was hitting them, you can see the light bloom and the bluish purple color there. You may even be able to see a slight purple cast on the bridge in the brightest areas. So this lens does have a fair amount of color fringing. But it's not really surprising at this price point, and it really wasn't enough to totally ruin the images. If I used the slider in Lightroom to remove purple fringing, it became much less noticeable in most images. But just for comparison, here is another unedited crop taken with a 420mm focal length telescope that I have set up to use as a camera lens. You can see the color is more natural with the lack of the purple fringes. You may also be able to see a difference in sharpness too, but keep in mind this telescope is much more expensive than this Lightdow lens. And this is a crop, so the difference in sharpness isn't as notable in the full images. Here is the full image of the geese on the bridge from the Lightdow lens, and you can see that without cropping or zooming, the fringes aren't really that noticeable. Just be aware that it is something that you will get with this lens, particularly on bright, high contrast parts of the image. One interesting difference between the Lightdow lens and the telescope I mentioned is how different the color was in the images. I took these two images one right after another, same camera, same settings. Neither image has been edited at all. You can see how much warmer the image is from the telescope as compared to the Lightdow. I did notice a slight color difference in other shots, but it really stood out in this one. And just so you know, the color from the telescope was more accurate to the real thing. But for comparison, here's the image from the Lightdow lens after I did my usual edit and export with Lightroom. This lens does have some sharpness fall off in the corners, and overall it's not what I would call tack sharp, but it is better than I expected. Ultimately, it's far from perfect, and it will require some effort and patience to get optimum results. But if you're willing to deal with that, I think the optical performance is okay for the price if you really want long focal lengths. So if you have any questions, post them up down below. As always, thanks for watching. Take care.